Hello, Ace and Beaky here. I decided that I would throw a little something to sort of finish off what I did in my first video. Again, I'm trying to offer advice from a neutral standpoint, somebody that was okay with the original Thundercats and had a decent respect for the 2011 reboot, but isn't a Thundercats fanatic, isn't like this huge thing. I'm telling you what somebody in the army told me, which was the best advice comes from a neutral standpoint. So this is Ace and Beaky once again, trying to throw a few solutions to some of your Thundercat fans who are reeling from the trauma of Roar like it was y'all's version of Pearl Harbor. I mean, I see y'all getting mad, and I don't hold it against you. I'm not going to say that all fanboys getting mad are toxic. I understand, but at the same time, it's not above getting a little bit of fun poked at it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Thundercat people, whatever. My solution to Thundercats Part 2. Again, and I told you, not the biggest fan. I'm just thinking about what would be a logical solution that I think would please the most people. Kind of being like the big idea guy, and I'm trying to think that maybe it would also have potential to please new viewers. What I think should happen is after some good writers, preferably consisting of many of the writers of the 2011 anime reboot, should work on and finish and flesh out what plans they already had for a season 2, but leave room in that season 2 for it to end in events leading up to and explaining the original 80s Thundercats. What I'm basically saying is pull a Star Wars Rogue One with it. I'm saying after you make the most of the ideas that were already written down for season 2, you flesh them out, you fill in the holes, add a little filler here, add a little twist there, but make it to where its ending leads up to the events of the first episode of the 80s Thundercats, where the Thundercats are fleeing on refugee ships and are getting blown in outer space by Mumra's minions. That's where the second season would end. It leads up to that. And I'm saying, like I said, make like the bulk of the flesh what they've already got planned out for season 2, and if that's not enough, you're going to have to come up with your own stuff. But what I am saying for you to do is that make it lead up to the events of the original Thundercats in the same way that Rogue One led up to the events of A New Hope. And what I'm saying is that have it to where it leads up to that first episode of the original 80s Thundercats, but on the reboot's terms. And then once that's established that the Thundercats land on a new planet, then have it where it goes blank and it kind of pulls a Star Wars Rebels on you and it jumps forward so many years. Like, you know how season 2, I think it was season 2, and Star Wars Rebels ended with Kanan going blind and Ahsoka apparently dying, and Darth Vader not being introduced but getting a good fight and the Inquisitors dying. And then in the next season, years had passed. Maybe not a whole lot of years, but enough time had passed. Everybody had grown a little older. Ezra had grown a little taller. He got a new haircut. Kanan let his hair grow out, yada, yada, yada. Well, I'm saying after you finish season 2 of Thundercats, again, working with what they were already writing out, adding your own stuff, and having it end to where it leads up to the story and the plot of the original 80s Thundercats. Have it in there, and then with season 3, it will have jumped forward past all of the events of the original Thundercats, even 5 years after the last event of the original 80s Thundercats. And here's where I go with a season 3. And the season 3 would be based, at least initially, and partially on some well received comic books that were meant to be a follow up to the original Thundercats. And boy, did they take a mature tone. And the thing is that so that I don't have to explain it, so that I don't have to give you the name of the comics because I haven't read them myself, there is a YouTuber who's more established than me, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning him for this, because I'm not trying to take his name in vain, and I've never met the guy personally. I've just watched a few of his shows, but you know that a YouTuber named Just Some Guy? He's really big into comics. He's also really big into complaining about SJWs. For reasons I understand, to extents I can partially understand. Well, the thing is that if you just go to his website, he's got a video explaining this comic book series based on what happens after the events of the original 1980s Thundercats cartoon. And it's a comic book, but it's taken on a much more mature tone. And apparently, Lion-O falls asleep for 5 years, and he's got to come back, and everybody else has grown up, and he's got to set things right. And what I'm saying is that with the season 3 of a Thundercats reboot anime, make it to where the original Thundercats 80s cartoon is actually part of the story, but they don't show that. They don't try to redo that. They don't try to fix what isn't broken. They just say, here's the anime. It's leading up to the original Thundercats cartoon show. And then it's going to skip over that time period because you already know what happens. And then it's going to go into a time period that's new. And at least the first third or so is going to be based off of this comic book series with some augmentations to make it better. Now, how would you make the comics book series better? Just watch Just Some Guy. He has a kind of like a halfway anime cartoon picture of himself, and he kind of looks like uh, an anime guy with kind of like a top mask that looks like a blue Spider-Man mask, and he has a red and white jacket on. You'll know him when you see him. And he's made a video explaining what's good and bad about the comic book. And I would just say, you take notes from him, you take notes from the fans and other people about what was good and what was bad. Go with what was good. Try to change or cut out or delete or replace what was bad with something better. And you will have the outline and skeleton of the next 2 seasons of the 2011 Thundercats reboot. It would be like it would start out as 2 prequels to the original 80s Thundercats and then a sequel. Now, my advice on the second season for small details that kind of help bridge the gap. You know how the Star Wars prequels and the Star Wars originals had like very different aesthetics and looks, and it was kind of hard to see the Star Wars prequels and the Star Wars originals in the same universe? But then movies like Rogue One and Star Wars Rebels and certain games like The Force Unleashed, they did a good job of kind of trying to, show the fusion between, prequel era Star Wars and original trilogy era Star Wars. They kind of tried to make an in between so there's something of a bridge between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy so that they don't completely feel like 2 separate worlds. Well, my advice for that with the Thundercats would be for season 2, since the world in the Thundercats reboot is so different from the world in the 80s one, my advice for that would be this. Like Rogue One, have the events of the first few episodes of the second season lead up to the beginning of the original Thundercats. Yes, have the story of the 2011 reboot if it gets a 2018 continuation. Have it have episodes eventually leading the Thundercats getting more refugees to get on ships to fly to a new planet, as I've said. But don't redo the original Thundercats. Just show over a season or part of a season how Lion-O gets more mature and his followers more compassionate as he gets older. They start to look more like their 80s counterparts. Because if you watch the Thundercats 2011 reboots, the Thundercats were dicks and hardasses. And Lion-O was the one who was compassionate but immature. And the rest of his buddies were hard asses on him until he grew up. But when Lion-O finally grew up, manned up, and toughened up while still maintaining his morals and nobility, they felt like they had a strong enough leader that they could back off a bit and start becoming more compassionate and start leaving their more morally gray, barbaric, and manipulative, harsh sides behind. Now, that would explain how the Thundercats as a whole became nicer. Lion-O became less nice, but he was still just as moral. And whenever he became a stronger leader that still maintained his morals, it actually made the other guys calm down a bit and actually be a bit nicer because they felt like their leadership was strong enough to see them to the end of the day so that they weren't constantly having to toughen up or to give him sass and throw challenges to him so he could figure out how to use his authority. Now, one thing that could help the story is when we see Mumra, we understand to better control his minions, he elevates those beast men who declare loyalty to him by making them mutants. They are somehow altered to better serve him. This would explain why Mumra calls his servants mutants in the 80s original. They started out as just lizards and apes and whatnot, but when they got mutated, they started to resemble the original 80s design more. Perhaps some were clones or offshoots or hybrids, which could explain why they took different forms. Maybe the fact that a lot of them became more stupid and were just muscles shows that they were clones that weren't meant to think, but were just meant to fight. The second season should eventually lead to Lion-O and his crew growing, changing, and finding enough refugees of cat people to go to another planet away from Mumra, so that the end of the season can lead to the events of the beginning of the original TV show. That in and of itself wouldn't take up an entire season. If the second season was already written or partially written, get the writers, or good writers, if you can't get the original writers, get good writers, to fill in the holes and finish what was already there. Just be sure to season and end it with an ending that leads to the events of the first episode of the original. And then say, so many years later, and jump to events after the original 80s reboot. The YouTuber, just some guy, and again, I don't know him, I've never met the guy, I would hate to do anything that would offend him or take his name in vain or make him feel like I would violate him, but for future reference, he's made a good YouTube video that explains the comic books so that I don't have to. So that you could go to his YouTube, watch that video about the comic books, and then you'll already get an idea of what I'm going at because I don't want to necessarily go there, research it, and say everything. He already made a good YouTube video explaining the comic books. So go and watch that and see if it makes any sense to you. But that YouTuber called Just Some Guy, that's his name, Just Some Guy, brought up a comic book series that was a continuation of the original 80s Thundercats show. It had a much, much more mature and bleaker take on Thundercats, as he explains in his video. I don't want to take his name in vain. I hope he doesn't mind me doing a mention of him so that anybody who watches this will go and watch his show for the sake of gaining knowledge. So I do feel kind of scared about saying this, but it's the easiest thing I can think of. Anyway, if you watch this video, it will make sense as he describes the plot of the comic book that was supposed to be a continuation of the original. The comic book, with some filler and fleshing out, as well as any other ideas for storylines, could be used for the second half of a season 2, if there's enough room for it, or more likely the beginning of a season 3. So basically take what the writers have already written for season 2, finish it, augment it to lead up to the events of the original 80s Thundercats TV show with explanations for differences, and then have a jump in time to the next season, which would be, at least initially and partially, based on the comic series that Just Some Guy reviewed. Take his criticisms and compliments for the comic book series and work for there. Emulate and possibly expand on what it did right, add or alter what he found was lacking. Try to add more chapters to the story. And that is a continuation of my proposal for what fans of the original Thundercats should do. To recap, in the first video, I basically said just try to revitalize the 2011 reboot into everybody's memory by making a point to watch it again and have other people watch it so that more people see it, more people know about it, more people talk about it, and then maybe you can start petitioning Netflix to give it another season like they did with Young Justice. And this video was recapping on what the second season should be about, how it should pretty much lead up to the events of the 1980s original, and then timeline wise skip over the events of the 1980s original and start a third season that is, at least initially, at least partially, based on the comic book series that was reviewed by just some guy. This is Ace and Beaky, and I am signing off, and I wish you luck in your endeavors. Have a good day.